welcome to 5 Things to Know, a Tax Talk Today exclusive. I'm joined today by James R. McTigue, Jr., Director of Tax Policy and Administration in the Strategic Issues team at the GAO. Jay holds a master's degree in public and private management from Yale School of Management and has had a distinguished career with over 30 years of GAO audit experience, including over a decade auditing the IRS programs and operations that impact the tax gap. Specifically, he is overseeing the GAO efforts to improve the IRS in many fronts, including oversight of paid tax preparers, reducing improper payments of refundable tax credits, such as the EITC, and assessing IRS administration of economic impact payments and advance payments on the child tax credit. Jay, on behalf of our viewers, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Tax Talk Today, where IRS representatives and industry leaders come together to share their knowledge and experiences working with the federal tax law. As a career practitioner and an industry advocate, I know as well as anyone the importance of our community providing feedback to the IRS. I would like to ask a little bit more about the important role of the GAO in auditing the IRS programs and operations. But if you wouldn't mind first, can you explain a little bit about your role with the GAO and in overseeing the IRS operations?
Yes, first off, thank you, Alan, for having me today. I appreciate this opportunity to talk with you as well as the broader tax community. As far as GAO, we are an independent, nonpartisan agency that works for Congress. We're part of the legislative branch. GAO is often referred to as the congressional watchdog because we look to see how federal dollars are being spent across the federal government. Primarily, we conduct performance audits. And when I talk about performance audits, that can range from looking at individual programs or other activities of agencies, including the IRS. And basically, we're looking at the efficient and effective operation of those programs and operations. As I said, GAO strives to provide the Congress and the public with objective, nonpartisan, fact-based information to facilitate their oversight responsibility and reduce fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government. In fact, in fiscal year 2022, GAO saved $56 billion. And over the last 5 years, GAO has returned $145 for every dollar invested in GAO. Specifically at IRS, at any given time, we have about 24 audits of various IRS programs and activities, ranging from taxpayer service to enforcement efforts and collection activities. Our efforts are basically driven by the annual tax gap, the difference between taxes owed and taxes paid voluntarily and on time. And reducing the tax gap has been a focus of GAO and has been on GAO's high-risk list for a very long time. In our work, we have identified 3 key elements to help reduce the tax gap. Number 1 is improving taxpayer service to ease the burden on compliant taxpayers and facilitate voluntary compliance. And this is where, the tax preparation community plays an integral role. The second is strengthening the effectiveness of IRS's compliance and enforcement efforts to bring more people into compliance and ensure the fairness of our tax system. And then finally, something a little bit out of our control, but we like to try to influence, and that is simplification of the tax code to basically make it easier to comply with the code and also reduce opportunities for tax evasion.
That would be, everybody's dream is a simplified tax code. But I would think that I've got too many questions to ask today that I think we'll hold this one for another conversation. How does the work of the GAO support taxpayers? In a broad, you've kind of touched on a little bit, but if you can give a little more detail, maybe an example or two.
Oh, sure. So the overriding goal of GAO audits is to improve IRS operations And, that comes down to improving the efficiency and effectiveness of IRS in meeting its own mission, which is providing taxpayers with top quality service to help them understand and meet their tax responsibilities, but also enforcing the law with integrity and fairness to all. And I mentioned earlier that we have about 24 audits ongoing. Currently, we have about 200 open recommendations to IRS. And that's something that we continually track once we finish our audit work and have made findings and recommendations to IRS. We track each and every recommendation until it is implemented. And while there are 200 recommendations that remain open, many of those IRS has made considerable progress in terms of actually implementing and getting the recommendation closed. I guess one other thing that I would mention at this point is that, as you're aware, last year Congress provided IRS with nearly $80 billion to help it modernize and improve taxpayer service, as well as enhance its enforcement capabilities. And this is an area that GAO wants to focus on very carefully over the next several years to ensure that IRS is held accountable for the proper and effective use of this funding and make those improvements and implement the recommendations, those 200 recommendations that I mentioned.
Well, that's fantastic to know. I mean, as crazy as it sounds, I've been defending this $80 billion, both to my peers and my clients for the last year or so. I know that I've been dealing with the IRS on the front line, so I understand how underfunded they've been. It's good to know the GAOs out there just kind of overseeing a little bit as well. What are some of the important details of the GAO's recent report to the IRS that we should be aware of?
Right. So back in, I believe it was December, we issued a report looking at abusive tax schemes. And we did this work at the request of Congress because, as you may know, IRS created in 2021 an office called the Office of Promoter Investigations. And that was put in place to coordinate its response to various promoter schemes and scams. IRS has always had a presence in identifying various scams and protecting taxpayers, but those operations have been scattered across the various operating divisions and offices at IRS. So the idea was to centralize that effort and bring people together, to leverage the expertise and information in the agency to more effectively go after the fraudsters, the promoters, and their enablers. Yes, some, I hope I don't offend anyone. Some, sometimes paid tax preparers are part of that group. Certainly not the enrolled ones, but it's a diverse community, and so IRS has been, working to, kind of gear up in this area, and so we wanted to make sure that IRS wasn't simply shuffling people around or boxes around, that they really had a plan in place to bring the people together in the activities as I described, but also to measure success, to be able to determine whether or not they were achieving their goals of reducing scams and schemes and, leveraging the preparer community to help protect taxpayers.
That's great. I believe in working together as much as we can. As I mentioned, I'm involved with the practitioner liaison meetings in my area. So, this is what we do as far as practitioners. The IRS has put out a couple of news blasts or email blasts lately that I've seen about choosing a preparer wisely, I think, is the best way to phrase that. So I see your work is being heard as far as that side of it is concerned. What are the, if you could give me the top 2 or 3 or even 5 if you want, recommendations that the GAO has given to the IRS, let's say within the last year or so?
Sure. Well, in terms of the information that you were just describing from IRS, I think that is part of their annual effort that they've undertaken over the last 20 years or so, highlighting what they call the dirty dozen list. Basically, that is a list of the most abusive abuses out there in terms of tax schemes and other scams. And I'd like to clarify that when I talk about tax schemes and scams, it basically illustrates that there's a wide range of different approaches that fraudsters and promoters take. Some are very complex and targeted at high income, high wealth individuals who may be interested in trying to hide income, or otherwise reduce their tax liability. And a couple that come to mind, again, I'm sure you're familiar with, is syndicated conservation easements, where through very complex transactions and high valuations that maybe can't be supported by actual facts are used to reduce the tax liability. And another one is micro captive insurance companies that look like insurance arrangements, but in fact fail one of the basic tenets of transferring risk of insurance. And again, these schemes involve multiple levels, different transactions, offshore accounts potentially, and again, very complex. Then on the other end of the spectrum, and I think today IRS highlighted some of the scams that it's seeing on social media, where promoters and scammers are suggesting that taxpayers falsify W-2 forms and other IRS forms to increase a refund. But the bottom line is IRS is looking very carefully at these scams and is aware of them. If any promoter is suggesting this to a taxpayer, I think it's key that the taxpayer stop and think, is this too good to be true? Why are they pushing so hard? Look for red flags that potentially this isn't on the level. And that's where preparers come in, play a vital role in helping educate taxpayers about these different schemes and scams and protect them. So again, IRS really values its partners in the industry and definitely can, play a big role in this area.
Great. Now you kind of walked into my next question here, which is great. I love that. What can preparers do to help? I mean, you brought it up, and I've seen in my career, which spans a few years now, as my silver shows, but I've seen some interesting things where, for instance, I might be representing a taxpayer, and I look at the preparer in an examination. And I look at the preparer and I see the preparer's name signing returns, and I get another taxpayer and I see the same preparer, and I see the same kind of issues on these returns that obviously the preparer might be getting a little, I'll use the term creative, because my clients don't seem to know when I ask them those questions. When I run into something like that, or other preparers, we see things that are out there, or other preparers out there promoting something that we know just is so far out there, like the line around the block because guaranteed refunds for all. What can we do? Who do we reach out to? That'd be something to reach out to GAO, IRS, both?
Yeah, absolutely. Number one, report it to the IRS. And, that was something that we looked at when we were looking at the schemes. And we talked a little bit about the dirty dozen list. And if you mention the dirty dozen list, I mean, almost everyone, particularly in the tax community, is aware of that list. What we found and raised to IRS's attention, and I'm happy to say they acted on this, was the fact that, they have this great promotion campaign, this education campaign, but yet they didn't have in the dirty dozen list or the news releases what someone like yourself or an average taxpayer should do if they have suspicions or see something that seems too good to be true or whatnot. So what IRS did was actually, if you look at this year's Dirty Dozen list, you will see how to report suspected abusive tax promotions to the IRS. They have a form, they have a mailing address, perhaps a fax number as well. So, number one, I would suggest doing that. Number two, there's also the IRS Office of Whistleblower, which again, they're there to crack down on abusive tax schemes where, more probably some of the more sophisticated schemes, but that is another option. And then finally, yes, GAO has a website. It's called FraudNet, and individuals can go to that website and report information of a suspected waste, fraud, and abuse. And then finally, I mentioned how IRS has this information on their website about how to mail in a form, fill out a form, mail it in, or fax it in. That's old school. A couple of years back, we looked at what is called information referrals from the public. And that is actually one of the key sources of information for IRS in identifying new or emergent schemes. Information from the public or other agencies, tax preparers. And what we found back then was that IRS has, I forget the number, maybe 10 different forms for different types of concerns that the public might have about what they're seeing in, tax administration. So what we recommended is that to reduce confusion as to which form or how to, where to mail the form, that IRS should set up an online portal to collect and then funnel in all this different information from the public, very valuable leads. And then IRS could, given that the information is digital, they could then more easily sort through the information that is reported online in a digital format. And IRS is still working on that recommendation. We hope, and again, with the new funding, hopefully they can speed up the implementation of such an online portal to simplify and make it easier for taxpayers, tax practitioners, and other people to report suspected tax schemes and scams.
Well, this has been a really great conversation, Jay. Thank you so much for joining me on 5 Things to Know. On behalf of our viewers, I want to thank you for your service with the GAO, especially in your current role directing tax policy and administration and strategic issues. Your work really benefits the IRS and the tax preparer community, as well as our nation's taxpayers. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you on a future Tax Talk Today program. Thank you all for watching, and as always, it's been great learning with you. Be sure to join us on an upcoming Tax Talk Today program.